Good evening, friends. Welcome to Beulah ATL's Word on Wednesday series. I am so excited to welcome each and every one of you all tonight for a dynamic and engaging presentation for the month of March. We are celebrating Women's History Month right here at Beulah Baptist Church, and we are so excited to have Dr. Nicole Simmons presenting on womanist theology and reclaiming the body for the next 3 weeks. I am excited because, like a kid in the candy store, I know she's going to be a blessing to us. But we always start with a word of prayer to ground ourselves. And so tonight, wherever you are, whether you are watching this broadcast live on Facebook or YouTube, or you're catching the replay after you got home from work, preparing a meal, running kids to and fro, soccer practice, ballet practice, whatever extracurricular activities you have going on, I want to invite you in this moment to pause, turn inward, situate your body. If you can, place your hands flat on a surface. Place your feet flat. Feel your body. Take a moment to breathe in and take a moment to exhale. Let's pray. God, we thank you for being our mother and our father. We thank you for being an eternal parent. God, we thank you for being our friend and our confidant, and we thank you for getting us through the hump. Thank you for walking with us and talking with us along life's journeys. God, we pray now that you would allow the words that come forth from Dr. Nicole Simmons to penetrate our hearts, minds, and souls. God, I pray that you would use her in such a way that would help us to get a better understanding of your word. For after all, your word does say, "And all of thine getting, get understanding." God, I pray tonight that you would help us to leave empowered, encouraged, and educated all the more about the unsearchable riches of your word. In your many names we pray. People of God said amen. Friends, just by way of announcement, again, tonight we are excited to have with us for the month of March Dr. Nicole Simmons, who is an assistant professor of Christian ethics at Columbia Theological Seminary. Throughout the month of March, tonight, next week, Wednesday the 19th, and the week after that, March the 26th, Dr. Nicole Simmons is going to be leading us through this course in partnership with the Candler Foundry. This is a course on reclaiming the body, a womanist theology of belonging, inclusion, and grace. We've talked about womanism just a little bit. Some of you all may remember last year we had three dynamic presenters, the Reverend Dr. Gabby Cujo Wilkes, the Reverend Dr. Kaya Jennings, and Reverend Janice Williams, who led us beautifully through a series called Hidden Figures, celebrating women in the Word. And so tonight we have a different angle, but the same effect. And we are excited to have Dr. Simmons with us. She's going to lead us through this courageously and prophetically as we prepare for Women's History Month. We also want to remind you by way of announcement that our young adult retreat is happening this weekend at Callaway Gardens and Resort in Pine Mountain, Georgia. The cost is only $20. If you are between the ages of 18 and 30 something, you may remember the sitcom from the 90s called Living Single. Well, there's scripture for that. And we're going to talk about it this weekend with a dear friend of mine, none other than the Reverend Michael Walren III, who is the young adult pastor at the First Corinthian Baptist Church of Harlem, New York. If you have not signed up yet, this is the last opportunity you will have. Again, the cost is only $20. Scan that QR code in the bottom left corner of the graphic to sign up. We have a couple of villas. We're going on a boating and fishing trip. We're going to walk through the botanical gardens. We're going to worship. We're going to cry. We're going to pour our hearts and souls out. And we invite you all to journey with us this weekend. I also want to remind you that our men's breakfast is swiftly approaching at Morehouse College in partnership with the 100 Black Men of Atlanta, specifically the collegiate chapter of Atlanta. We are excited to welcome Dr. Ilya Davis as our guest speaker. This is taking place on Saturday, April the 5th at 10 o'clock a.m. Brothers, it does not cost you a dime. We want to make sure that we invest in the next generation of leaders and scholars and brothers who are coming up. The Bible teaches us that we ought to pour back into people the same way that Paul poured into Timothy, the same way that Elizabeth poured into Mary. We want to make sure that we are pouring into the children in our community and at Morehouse College and in the Collegiate 100. We know that we stand on the shoulders of giants. And so we are privileged to be able to stand under the shade of trees that we did not plant. Please, sir, we want you to sign up on the website. Go to beulaatl.org and you can go to our events tab and sign up there. We look forward to having each and every one of you all with us on that day. I am also excited because we are doing amazing ministry at Beulah Baptist Church. And I want you to know that on Sunday, April the 6th from 12 to 2 p.m., in addition to our free community meal, the farmers market of Eat Right Atlanta will be at Beulah Baptist Church. Dr. Heber Brown of the Black Food Security Network says, whoever feeds you is who frees you. We know that Beulah, outside of there being a Walmart in our community, there are a host of fast food restaurants that may not be the healthiest options for Black and brown people to consume. We want to combat food insecurity in District 3 and Vine City and the West End. And this is one of the many ways that we can do that. Please, ma'am, please, sir, whoever you are, wherever you are, help us to spread the word. Eat Right Atlanta is bringing fresh produce in a farmer's market on Sunday, April the 6th. It does not cost you a dime. You will be able to get free produce on that Sunday. We want to be a blessing to the community. So please, ma'am, please, sir, help to share the word. Lastly, and finally, I want to remind you all that a couple of weeks ago on Monday, March 3rd, our second installment of a program called Grief Share kicked off, and this will be running from March 3rd to Monday, June the 2nd. This is a 13-week intensive for people who are navigating loss, who are navigating transition, and who are navigating the difficulties of life. If you are grieving or someone you know may be grieving due to a recent death, maybe some cyclical nature of depression, whatever the case may be, we have an amazing care team at Beulah ATL that would love to get you registered. It's my understanding that we had upward of 20 people back in December when we did What Do the Lonely Do at Christmas. We want to continue to be a blessing to people. Help us to spread the word so that we can make sure that people's needs are met. The Bible teaches us that Jesus doesn't just care about our physical needs. Jesus cared about the emotional and the psychological as well. The Bible tells us, beloved, above all things, I would that you would prosper and that your soul and your mind would be in good health. We want you to be in good health at Beulah Baptist Church. So please, ma'am, please, sir, whoever or wherever you are, do govern yourselves accordingly. Friends, I'm excited because I don't have to teach tonight, but I promise there is one among us who is well able. And I am excited to welcome a colleague from Emory University, Candler School of Theology. Dr. Nicole Simmons is a native of Florida by way of New York. She is a graduate of Florida A&M University. Shout out to our HBCUs, where she earned her bachelor's degree, and she also earned a Master of Divinity degree and her doctorate in ethics and society from Emory University, Candler School of Theology. Currently, Dr. Simmons is an assistant professor of Christian ethics at Columbia Theological Seminary since her appointment in July of 2023. Formerly, she was the visiting professor of Christian ethics at Mercer University, McAfee School of Theology. She is a remarkable scholar, a celebrated teacher, highly sought after speaker, and a generous colleague who is deeply committed to theological education and cutting edge ethical engagement for the sake of the church and the world. Beulah ATL, do me a favor in the chat tonight. Make sure you all welcome Dr. Nicole Simmons. Blow those chats up on Facebook and YouTube. And I also want to remind you, at any point during tonight's presentation, we are encouraging each and every one of you all to put your questions in the chat. I know she's going to blow our minds tonight, but I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to engage with her. If you put your questions in the chat on Facebook or on YouTube Live, I promise we will get them. And at the conclusion of her presentation, she and I will have an opportunity to engage in a few moments of Q&A, and we'll read your questions as well. Without further ado, friends, I would like to, at this time, bring on Dr. Nicole Simmons for our conversation tonight, celebrating women in the Word. Dr. Simmons, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're going to give you the floor. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Pastor Rice. And thank you to the Beulah ATL community for allowing me to be here. I am so excited to be with you all for the next 3 weeks in thinking about womanist theology, thinking about the body. I am passionate about both things. You see a little bit of it in my bio. But I want to say that when I initially started thinking about this course for Beulah and for other spaces in which I've taught it, I could not have imagined the world that we would be inhabiting as we are inhabiting it right now. That is, I could not imagine the backdrop of a conversation about reclaiming the body at precisely a moment in which our bodies are in danger of being claimed, right? Politically, in some very real ways. Yet, God, in God's infinite wisdom, as mother, as father, as all, knew the road that would lie ahead and the one that we are all facing. And so, tonight and for the next 2 weeks after this, my hope for this space is that it will be one that helps us think about how you reclaim your body for yourself on your terms, right? This is Women's History Month. We're focused on womanist thinking, womanist theology, which is, it is centering the Black experience, Black women's experience, and how that also relates to Black community experience. So the gift of being able to teach this class right now, to be with you all, is we get to just focus on Blackness, right? And not against whiteness and not against everything else, but for our sake. So my hope is that you might craft practices of embodiment, embodied liberation, in an understanding of the Imago Dei, for whom we are created in the image of. And my hope is that you will all reclaim the power of what we know from the late Toni Morrison of this here flesh, right? Of a beloved community that is infleshed. So without further ado, let us jump into tonight's topic. So we are thinking about the sacred body, Imago Dei, and divine revelation of the Black body. So we have a few objectives before us tonight, two major ones, and then we will look ahead to what next week is. So let's go to the objectives really quickly. Unless I have control. Oh, there they go. Sorry. So we will do two things tonight, right? And one thing about me, I am liable to always over prepare. So we will have plenty good room, plenty good content. But first and foremost, we're going to explore a single biblical foundation of embodiment through Genesis 1, through the creation narrative that we all know very well. And then we're going to look at the relationship between what is called theological anthropology and the Imago Dei. So theological anthropology is a method of us thinking about how God understands the human body, understands the relationship between human embodiment and God's self. So I want to open with a question that can be answered maybe if you want to drop a word in the chat or even just in your own reflective time for about a minute, right? 60 seconds. So my opening question for you all is, in this moment, how do you feel in your body? Right? I love how Pastor Rice started us out, and it reminds me of how much God is in the details, because this morning in one of my classes, we started out with a embodied meditation using the work of Howard Thurman, the concept of centering down, which is all about getting into our bodies. So in this moment, how do you feel in your body, right? Are your shoulders up by your ears? Are you stressed out? Are you sick in your body? If you want to drop a word in the chat, if you just want to share how you're feeling in the body, because this connects to how we're going to even conceive of what is going on when we think about embodiment. So I think I see a few. I'll just wait a little moment, give us a moment of silence to reflect on how do you feel in your body. Tense. Yes, I feel that. I feel that, Veronica. Tense. Calm. Yes. Tightness. So we're feeling a few different things in our bodies, right? But one of the things, and I think that Lent gives us an especially prescient moment to think about bodies anxious because we actually get to kind of slow down in Lent. I don't know if anybody feels like the liturgical season avails itself to slowing down, but I think one of the opportunities that Lent gives us is to slow down, to take a minute. So what I want to offer is maybe, even if it's just for 60 seconds, just as we did, to do a what is called a body scan. How are you breathing? How are you feeling? How is your heart functioning? Right? The past couple of days, I have felt like my heart has been beating more rapidly than ever because of anxieties of the world around us. So always check into your body. So, because we're talking about the body, let's define what we will mean by embodiment over the next few weeks. So, we'll be thinking about embodiment in a couple of ways, right? Rooted in physical experience, right? Rooted in what's happening, right? This here flesh. It's also haptic in nature. So haptic is a kind of fancy way of thinking about touch, right? It's tactile. It's reliant on how we react to touch, both individually and in community, right? There are womanist thinkers. I think about the Reverend Dr. Courtney Bryant, who has a book entitled Erotic Defiance. And she talks about haptic theology, right? Haptic womanist theology in particular. How do Black women, how do Black people experience touch, good, bad, indifferent, and how can we renegotiate our relationship to it? Three, when we're thinking about embodiment, it results in a tangible expression of ideas about our bodies, but more clearly about our flesh. So you'll note that there's something of a difference between an understanding of body and flesh, right? I might invite you via the chat and be conversational, right? I might belong to and be Catholic now, but my religious story and heritage is within Baptist spaces. So I love a little talk back, right? So when you think about the difference of body and flesh, I'd be curious to know, what do you think is the difference between a body and flesh, right? I'll continue talking, but I want you to kind of process that out, be in conversation in the chat, and then I'll give us the answer a little bit later on. But I love communal knowledge building. And last but not least, when we're thinking about embodiment, it eventuates in a return to the self as a self-autonomizing being. So if you think about how I opened up and thinking about what this opportunity to focus on reclaiming the body means for us, for Black people in particular, right? Black men, Black women, Black people, it gives us an opportunity to return to ourselves as self-autonomizing beings, right? And by that, I mean that we have control of our bodies. We regulate our bodies against a world that might seek to regulate it, right? Against a history that has functioned to talk about Black bodies in a very regulatory way, except for the fact that we have a broad history that does not begin with chattel slavery. So let us continue to think about embodiment in terms of biblical foundations for it. So Genesis 1 lays the groundwork for understanding human embodiment in relation to the divine, in relation to God. So this little section of slides that you will see is focusing on the creation narrative and the theological implications of being made in the image of God. And so in so doing, we are beginning to engage theoethical reflection. So as an ethicist, one of the things that I always teach and talk about are how we think about what are called moral sources, right? So if you are living in the world and you don't have to have a degree to be an ethicist or to be an ethical person, but an everyday person, right, is what is called a moral agent, if you will, right? Reverend Dr. Robert Franklin talks about the fact that we are all moral agents. We all have the power to act ethically in the world. But there are sources that guide us into that ethical thinking. And the Bible obviously appears in many Christian communities as a central and authoritative source for how we think ethically. So that's why we're starting with the Genesis 1 creation story. So first, when we are defining Imago Dei, we have one definition that we are all familiar with, right? Imago Dei as the image of God. But the more contemporary definition that I want us to hold on to and think through, not just in this short course, but even beyond this, is the fact that within the letters of Imago Dei, particularly the day, we actually see the very thing that we are wrestling with, right? That we've been watching unfold since what, January 20th? Imago Dei is also connected to the fact that the image of God is an image of diversity, of equity, of inclusion, right? I had this revelation a couple of months ago, which really, like, there might be nothing new under the sun, but when I made the connection between Imago Dei as the image of God, as well as thinking about how God welcomes diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, all of the letters that we have created in the corporatization of DEI. But when you drop DEI, you are not properly reflecting God's will and God's work in the world. So let's go to Genesis now that we know, or we're thinking more about the Imago Dei. So Genesis 1:26 through 27 in the NRSV tells us, open quote, "Then God said, let us make humankind in our image," not imagine, image, "according to our likeness, and let them have dominion," or stewardship, "over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over the animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, right? We keep going forward, right? So in Genesis 1:26 and 27, we see this powerful assertion that humanity is created in the image of God. This is a foundational text that establishes the inherent dignity and worth of every human body. And it encourages us to view ourselves as reflections of the divine, right? So we get that we're created in God's image. We get that we have inherent dignity, and we get that we are a reflection of the divine, right? And that changes the way that we move through the world. So my question to you, and this is an actual engagement, I'll give us a minute or two, is how do elements of the Imago Dei, be it in the Genesis creation story or otherwise, as you have engaged this concept of the image of God in life, how do the elements of the Imago Dei influence your perception of your own body, particularly your body as a Black person moving through the world? I would love to hear at least maybe one or two people who are courageous enough to share, how does an understanding of the image of God affect your body, your embodiment, right? Here I'm really inviting us to not be on the surface, but what do you think of your body in relation to the image of God, right? We often talk about it, I think, almost in abstraction in a sense, but the text offers us more opportunity to dive deeper into embodiment and the Imago Dei. So if there are any takers on how elements of the Imago Dei influence your perception of your body. So Jean says answering the question from a little bit earlier, the body is the physical makeup, and I think the flesh is what the body is made of. Yes, yes, I like that response and thinking, Jean. Anyone on elements of the Imago Dei and its influence on your perception of your body? Do you think about your body your physical makeup in regard to the Imago Dei, or are you just kind of like, I'm made in the image of God, and that is all she wrote, he wrote, they wrote? Well, hearing none for now or seeing none for now, I'll keep looking at the chat, but keep thinking about whether you actually think about your body in really deep ways in relation to the image of God. You strive to be a representation of God as a result of thinking about your body in the image of God. Yes, thank you for that, Marcus. So as you continue to think about how elements of the Imago Dei influence your perception of your own body, let's start going into our theological anthropology and the Imago Dei. So one, just to give us context, right? I try to be very intentional about the images that I use in my slides, right? And I try to be what is called Africana minded, right? Thinking about Black and African diasporic people. So the image that you see before you right now is an image of Maasai tribal people doing a tribal dance, which involves some of which like high elevation, jumping in the air, right? This is part of being created in God's image. This is part of embodiment too. And the embodiment is about the aesthetic, right? Looking at these beautiful draped fabrics they have over themselves, about how the red really just pops off of their complexion, right? Anita tells us the image being created in likeness of him and human form. Thank you for that, Anita. So when we think about what theological anthropology is, it explores what it means to be human in relation to God. And so we'll go through for the next few, and here's where I really want to invite questions. But we're going to think about how different theological perspectives contribute to our understanding of the Imago Dei and of embodiment, particularly from a womanist viewpoint. So as we kind of start getting into our womanist work, I want to start by having us listen to none other than one of our womanist foremothers, Alice Walker, who reads Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman? And I will talk about that as a proto-womanist reflection after we hear from Walker.
Here, the Black abolitionist Sojourner Truth, who was freed from slavery in 1827, speaks to a gathering of feminists in Akron, Ohio in 1851.
Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North, all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? They talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? Intellect. That's right, honey. Intellect. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now that they is asking to do it, the men better let them.
So I love visiting Sojourner Truth's speech, right? Ain't I a Woman, in which this Black woman is advocating for herself to be seen as a woman amidst people who did not accord Black women in particular that benefit, not even that benefit, right? That right. And so one of the things that I think about as I always revisit truth is that it is what I believe a first instance of womanist thinking. It also challenges us, right? That question that she asks, where did your God come from, right? Came from God and a woman, right? Or where did your Christ come from? God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with it. And so I appreciate the challenge that she offers us, because even to think about where did your Christ come from in bringing Mary into the picture in a very real way, reminding us that Mary birthed Christ, which means there was an in utero experience. There was an embodied experience that produced Christ in the world. So I encourage, especially because it's Women's History Month, for you to revisit it, right? Because truth gives us a lot of real gems of wisdom that I think, and I say this unfortunately, still applies to the way in which we advocate for body rights as Black people in the world. So I told you that Truth stands as a proto-womanist, but what is a womanist and what is womanism? So let's run through some of the definitions. We have a four-pronged format when we talk about womanism, right? First, that it is coined by Alice Walker. We get it through her work in Search of Our Mother's Gardens, as well as in an essay that precedes that. But it is four-pronged in nature, in which she states for us that a womanist is a Black feminist or feminist of color, and refers to outrageous, audacious, courageous, and willful behavior, right? That's why Sojourner Truth is this proto-womanist figure, right? Courageous and willful behavior is what she demonstrated. And so a womanist is also someone who wants to know more and in greater depth than is considered good for one. So here we always think about the kind of phrase of being grown, right? Or being womanish, being a little Black girl who just might have more questions than seems prudent. But that's actually that little Black girl exhibiting womanish qualities, right? On the way to being womanist. So secondly, a womanist is a woman who loves other women sexually and or non-sexually, appreciates and prefers women's culture, women's emotional flexibility, women's strength, right? In an expansion of womanism, it talks about womanist loving roundness, loving food, loving the sun, loving dance, right? A womanist is a lover of culture. We see a little bit too of this in the third part of the definition. Loves the arts, the earth, others, and herself, right? So womanism isn't just this kind of internal facing for Black women, but it's about loving self and loving self into community as well. Although one of the pins that we have to always acknowledge is that also embedded in the womanist definition is that womanists are separatists at times for the sake of health. Every now and then you have to withdraw, regroup, center down. And the last one, which is again a kind of question that I want to offer that you can answer as we continue to move forward, is always the most salient. People love to talk about this part of the definition. Womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender, right? So I would be curious to hear from you, and I'll talk you all through it too. What does it mean to you to hear that womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender, right? This is in thinking about the relationship between womanism and feminism. And one of the things to know, particularly if you are new to womanist thinking, is that womanism comes precisely because it's developed as a concept, a framework, a way of being, because early feminists were not paying attention to Black women, right? So womanists are like, okay, it's great that you're focused on issues of class and gender as early feminists were concerned about, but you have to pay attention to race alongside class and gender. And if you kind of go through a trajectory of what gets us to womanism proper, is we think about feminism, Black feminism, which enters as its own political framework that's really thinking about what are we advocating for, right? A good document to read is the Combahee River Collective Statement, in which a group of Black women, Black lesbians, are really advocating for people to pay attention to Black women. One of the salient lines in that statement is we have to pay attention to Black women's freedom, right? If Black women are not free, all or not, right? If we are not attending to issues Black women face, then we're really not attending to anything. But also, as we think about Black feminism, we also get womanism, we also get intersectionality. So this is where you kind of see the development of moving from thinking that exclusively privileges class and gender to thinking that thinks about race, class, and gender, and then thinks about the fact that those are intertwined, right? That is intersectionality. That is the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, as well as people such as Jennifer Nash. So continue to think about, what do you conceive of as this womanist is to feminist, as purple is to lavender? Is one deeper than the other? Is one stronger than the other? What's the relationship if you think in familial ways? So as we continue to develop womanist thinking, womanist theological thinking in particular, we also have to talk about the late Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, who is one of our important womanist ethical figures, right? As an ethicist, her work is important to me. And one of the things that Dr. Cannon did is think about where moral wisdom comes from, right? Moral being beliefs and values that have some kind of center, right? Some of that center can be drawn from biblical text. But Dr. Cannon would also say that we gain moral wisdom through literature, right? Think about the work of Walker in The Color Purple, or of Toni Morrison in Beloved, or in really Toni Morrison's Oeuvre, her canon of work. So Dr. Cannon would tell us that Black literature gives us moral wisdom, but she'll also talk about the fact that there are what she calls taken for granted areas where moral wisdom dwells. And this is particular to our Black communal spaces. So she says in Katie's Canon, page 59, this is in the first edition of the book, that the moral wisdom that exists in the Black community is extremely useful in defying oppressive rules or standards of law and order that unjustly degrade Blacks in society. So even just hearing that quote against the backdrop of what we currently exist in, you feel like Dr. Cannon was speaking into the moment. She was speaking into one moment. We unfortunately still exist in a moment where it's important for us to continue to think about where moral wisdom is, but we privilege the moral wisdom coming out of our own communities. I'm currently teaching a class right now at Columbia that is thinking about the ethics of nonprofit leadership or nonprofit organizations, but it's really about leadership. And one of the things that we're talking about a lot is who do we require to be moral, right? Can one ask a political figure to be moral? And I said very clearly that really the moral wisdom, the moral community, the beloved community that we're building comes from us. Our religious spaces are important. Our nonprofit spaces are important because that's where we can continue to develop and actually hear one another well. So I see some people voicing in the chat. So let's see, we've got womanist is the source of feminists. And then Winfred says, regarding this month for women's movement / history, the great, Groucho Marx has entered the chat, said, only one man in 1,000 is a leader of men. The other 999 follow women. Wow, thank you for sharing that. I'd never known that before. Thank you, thank you. I see also from this is from Mertice, thinking of her body as such a complex, marvelous machine. Yes, machine, but not in the sense that you must always produce. So as we continue to think of some womanist figures that are helping us think about theological anthropology and the body, let's go to Dr. M. Shawn Copeland, right? And no problem, Anita. These questions are meant to go with you along the way, and we can definitely continue to talk about it over the next 3 weeks. And let's see, feminist feels men and women should have equal rights. Yes, yes, but maybe not always. First and second wave are thinking like men and white women should have equal rights. Latter waves start thinking about race more, and so that becomes helpful. So here we have Dr. M. Shawn Copeland, who is Professor Emeritus of Systematic Theology at Boston College. She is a Black Roman Catholic and a systematic theologian. So in Dr. Copeland's seminal text, In Fleshing Freedom, she is focusing on the Imago Dei through Black women's bodies by shifting what was historically the preferred subject of anthropology and theological anthropology, right? So if you can imagine the preferred subject of anthropology at a time and theological anthropology was a white European male, right? So think about Enlightenment thinkers, if you are familiar with people such as Immanuel Kant, these early European Enlightenment figures who were thinking about the ideal subject as white men. But instead, Dr. Copeland says we actually need a new figure, right? So she explores how the dissemination of a European understanding of God, right? So one of the things she also talks about is that we've been taken for a long time by a European understanding of God, and that has impacted Black women's relationship with God and themselves. And so Dr. Copeland hopes to move us forward. So the quotes on this page come out of the first edition of In Fleshing Freedom. And so she says to us, what might it mean for poor women of color to grasp themselves as human subjects, to grapple with the meaning of liberation and freedom? So here in that passage, she's really starting to help us think, what would it look like to make Black women the center of our theological, anthropological thinking, right? So it follows that she says, what does it mean to recognize a new anthropological subject of Christian theological reflection, to identify exploited, despised, poor women of color as the subject? So In Fleshing Freedom has been a text that has been formative for me precisely because Dr. Copeland says we can center Black women as the center of our theological thinking. And this is what womanist theology does well, right? It's what it does, period, is that it centers the lived experience, right? The thinking, the embodiment of Black women as sources for how we think about ethics, right? Black women's bodies, Black people's bodies are sources of moral wisdom. So when we continue to think about the womanist theological perspective that M. Sean gives us, we can break it down in three little areas, right? And it kind of gives us a little bit of a return to thinking about the fact that womanist theology and In Fleshing Freedom, womanist theology through In Fleshing Freedom, emphasizes the body as sacred, and it reclaims it as a source of empowerment and identity for Black women, right? Our bodies are not anything we ought to be ashamed of. Next, womanist theology and In Fleshing Freedom is going to emphasize and center the experiences of Black women, right? So In Fleshing Freedom, and I highly recommend this book. It is an accessible read, and it draws on historical narratives, right? Dr. Copeland looks at first primary source slave narratives. She looks at the forgotten stories, but she also looks at more contemporary works. And so she's looking at highlighting the unique experiences of Black women and addressing their struggles and resilience in the context of spirituality. Lastly, but not least, and again, this is not a comprehensive list, but this is just some of what womanist theology does that we will be doing over the next few weeks, is that Copeland emphasizes the significance of embodiment in understanding freedom and spirituality from a womanist perspective. I was actually just thinking about the difference between freedom and liberation, right? Liberation as a part of a process, as a part of how we carve out spaces for ourselves to feel a sense of freedom. Freedom is often what we're trying to get to, but it's elusive, right? You may sometimes hear people say, you know, we exist in a relatively free world, right? And maybe we feel that more acutely than not at this time. So our penultimate slide for the night before we, hopefully, Pastor Rice and I can have a little bit of Q&A. The Imago Dei within womanist theology in particular helps us expand our understanding, right? Womanist theology expands the notion of the Imago Dei to embrace experiences of bodies that sit at the margins, and it enriches our understanding of humanity, right? Go back to that imago, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, embrace, all of the things, right? And womanist theology in regard to Imago Dei brings about a holistic understanding, right? I think about one of my colleagues who is currently at the Candler School of Theology. I'm blanking on her name, but Dr. LaRonda has a book that is about womanist holistic soteriology. So she's thinking about salvation for Black women in a holistic sense, right? Head to toe. LaRonda Little Welch, Dr. LaRonda Little Welch has a book, and I will create a little bit of a running biography or bibliography for those that are interested. But womanist theology in regard to holistic understanding is a theology that promotes a holistic perspective. It honors both individual identity and the significance of community in shaping our humanity, right? So womanist theology certainly functions at the level of privileging and honoring Black women's experience, but it is also concerned about how that connects to Black women in community and Black community, period. So tonight we really just kind of set a foundation for what will be our conversation over the next 2 weeks. So I want you to kind of look forward to what we will do next week. So, and I have a little bit of homework for you. So your homework is to reflect on how your understanding of the body as sacred can influence, and this is looking ahead to next week, can influence your engagement with respectability and body politics in the Black church, right? And we'll talk all about what is meant by respectability and body politics. If some are open, I'm happy to send a reading. It's a nice short reading from some biblical scholars, among them a womanist biblical scholar. And so some questions to ask yourself is, how do you view your body as sacred, right? And spend time journaling about this, right? Not just one sentence, but what are the facets of you viewing your body as sacred? Are there practices that you have that help you tap into your body as sacred? And then thinking about respectability in the Black church in particular, right? If we're thinking about an entire history of Black women in the Black church, how do you understand respectability in the Black church in relation to your body? And you can continue to kind of connect the nodes together from what we have discussed tonight in regard to womanist theology, theological anthropology, and the Imago Dei, all of which are instrumental in thinking about reclaiming the body. And so with that, that is my last slide for the evening. I know I've thrown a lot, but I hope that I've given you all a little bit of food for thought, or a lot of food for thought. So yeah, that is all I have for you now, but I invite questions as you have them. Yeah, questions, things that were generative for you. And, you know, Pastor Rice, you can hop on anytime. But yeah, so thank you so much for giving me this time to be with you. And I'm really excited for the next couple of weeks.
Come on, Beulah, will you all help me to celebrate and thank Dr. Nicole Simmons for this fascinating presentation tonight on reclaiming the body and understanding the idea of theological anthropology and womanism. We are so grateful, both on YouTube and Facebook. Would you all shower her with love on this evening and let her know how grateful we are for her? Of course, we have some questions. We want to know what your questions are. I see there are some people who are on YouTube tonight. Brother Merriweather, Kamari, McHenry, Sister Cynthia Jewell. If you all have questions, go ahead and throw those in the chat. And then all of our friends and family members who are on Facebook, if you all would throw those questions and place those questions in the chat for us, we would love to take your questions. And I say we, I mean she would love to take your questions. I'm not answering any questions, but I do have some that I would like for us to really think through. You began to talk a little bit about the differences between Black feminism and womanism. And I think for anybody who's familiar or has read the work of Alice Walker, we've heard this before in Search of Our Mother's Garden and subsequent works, that feminism is to womanism as lavender is to Purple, to the color purple. You also mentioned a little bit about, in response to Sister Jean Jordan Glover's question or comment rather, about the ways that feminism worked for white women and white men. And you mentioned something that caught my attention. You said something about first and second wave feminism. One of my favorite books is by a Black feminist by the name of Brittany Cooper. It's called Eloquent Rage. A Black feminist discovers her superpowers. And she talks about the differences of first and second white feminism and third wave feminism in the 90s and the 70s, respectively. Can you help those who may not really understand the differences between first, second, and third wave feminism? What does that really mean?
Yeah, so as not to get us too in the weeds, like the simplest way for us to think about what is meant when you hear somebody say first and second wave feminism is thinking about it historically, right? The first wave is concerned with, and of course, like now I'm blanking, right? But first and second wave, we're thinking about the white women who were active in the suffragists movement, right? And the way in which they incorporated, right? They permitted Black women to march with them in this right, trying to fight for the right to vote, but would only permit to a certain extent, right? Their political concerns, right? The early historical waves of white feminist work were concerned mostly about white women's access, white women's equality, partially because white women had a different set of rights because of their whiteness or their white phenotypic being. So when we think, and I'm happy to bring more in next week, when we think about waves, right, there are the early waves of feminist work that did not incorporate or think about race, think about Black women, think about anyone outside of white women. Later waves, when we get into the 60s and 70s and 80s and beyond, they begin to do better, but that's why Black feminism becomes really important, right? I appreciate you lifting Dr. Cooper's work. And as I said, the Combahee River Collective is a really important statement. And it's a short statement. It's about like a 10-page read, but I think it's a critical read if you want to chart that movement from feminism to Black feminism to womanism in order to think about what's happening politically.
This is a really interesting conversation that you've started tonight, and I really appreciate it, specifically as we think about certain womanist theologians. We know that there's a point of departure with James Cone and J.D. Otis Roberts, especially with Jacqueline Grant, Kelly Brown Douglas, Dolores Williams. We see it now with Dr. Teresa Fire Brown, Sean Copeland, Katie Cannon. What would you pinpoint and say is the major difference between Black feminism and womanism? I know that's a tough question. And there's so many, but just for people who are hearing this conversation for the very first time, they may not know the work of Toni Morrison or Bell Hooks or Audre Lorde. What would you say is maybe one takeaway nugget that people could walk away with that helps us to distinguish between the characteristics of Black feminism and womanism?
Yeah, so I think one of the differences that has helped me over the years is to think about the fact that womanists, particularly once you start engaging Dr. Cannon, Grant, Williams, right? These early womanist theologians are interested in Black women in the church, right? The first, again, like that wave language. So womanists in the late 80s and early 90s are really interested in what's going on with Black women in the church, right? We get Sisters in the Wilderness from Williams because she's interested in how, you know, Cone thinking about suffering, how that relates to Black women thinking about suffering. Whereas Black feminists are often early on are not necessarily concerned about Black women in the church. They're concerned about Black women broadly construed, but Christianity is not necessarily the framework in which they carry it out, right? And so sometimes, and this is me, right? Not all womanists think about it this way, but I think about Black feminists as thinking about spirituality in a sense, right? And Black womanists thinking about Christian religion. Now, it does also mean like Black feminists can think about Christian spirituality, but Black womanists are coming out of the church. Early Black womanists, and actually many Black womanists still to this day, have direct experiences with the church that lead them to ask bigger questions about how Black women's experiences in the church have produced certain ways of being for them. So that's kind of one central difference for me, is that one is a little more focused on Black women, Black Christian women in church spaces, Black religion, whereas one is thinking a little bit more spiritual, but there can be differences too, right? Some womanists are not concerned about Black women in the church, but are concerned about Black women's spirituality. And here I'm thinking about Laili Phillips. I always get the names mixed up, but she has a book entitled The Womanist Idea. It's either Laili Phillips or Laili Mapayan. She is one who would think about Black women's religious lives being pretty broad, right? Not just in the ambit of Christianity, but that Black women's spiritual heritage is actually very varied. And I think that even that's something valuable for us to talk about, is how we're exploring other things outside of our Christian faith stories.
This is absolutely, I can go on asking questions. I have more questions than we have time. I'm really interested in haptic eroticism and the way that we navigate touch and reclaim agency, especially because you talked about the fact that as we think about returning to self-autonomizing, we know that historically Black women and Black men were desexualized in the institution of chattel slavery. But you claimed it didn't just start there. I'm curious to know if there's a concise history that we can walk through, not tonight, but maybe in the future, about this kind of haptic eroticism, because Shawn Copeland, one of my favorite theologians as well, she talks about somatophobia in Flesh and Freedom, and there being this kind of fear of the flesh with this Platonic dualism, body and flesh distinction. Oh, but then you turn the corner and you bring in respectability, politics, and intersectionality. There's so much for us to unpack over these next 3 weeks, and I am super excited. But for the benefit of brevity, friends, we are going to end our conversation here tonight. We want to be respectful of Dr. Simmons' time. We always go 60 minutes for Word on Wednesday. So friends, take notes, buckle up your seatbelts. It is only going to get better. Again, if you all would help me to thank God for Dr. Nicole Simmons. She is a brilliant ethicist, thinker, theologian. And Professor Beulah, we are honored. We are grateful. We are lucky to have her sharing with the Beulah ATL family over the next couple of weeks. Again, Dr. Simmons, we say thank you for sharing this presentation tonight, and we look forward to learning from you and having you the next couple of Wednesdays as well. Thank you. Friends, I want to remind you all that, again, we are meeting on this coming Sunday for worship, and we can't wait to have you. Fulfillment Hour or Sunday School starts at 9:30, and we are celebrating the Beulah Wheel anniversary this coming Sunday. What is the Beulah Wheel anniversary? The Beulah Wheel is an auxiliary ministry of women founded in 1957 to do good in the community. They were interested in preferential treatment for the poor and finding out ways that we can serve the people. And so we're going to be honoring some of the women in our congregation on Sunday. We look forward to seeing you all there. Friends, as always, go with God, and I promise God will go with you. We love you dearly. Have a good night. Take care.